Washington lived in its usual rhythm: noisy streets, business suits, endless streams of cars, news, discussions, politics. On this day, the U.S. Capitol hosted an important state conference dedicated to the future of the country, key appointments in the presidential administration, and the political course of the coming years. A special atmosphere reigned in the huge hall where representatives of leading media, political scientists, experts, and journalists gathered. Microphones were set up, cameras were turned on, reporters sat in the front rows, ready to bombard the president with questions about everything that worries American society. The doors to the hall swung open and Donald Trump walked inside. He was in no hurry, walking confidently, calmly, like a man who was accustomed to attention, to public speaking, to thousands of eyes watching his every move. A buzz went through the hall, someone was quickly writing in notebooks, and the operators were aiming their cameras. Trump walked onto the stage, stood behind the podium, and looked around the audience. He loved moments like these. Moments when he had the chance to speak, when he commanded attention, when every phrase he uttered could become a headline in the press. And finally he began. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today." He paused, smiled slightly, and added, "I hope you enjoy our show." Some journalists smiled, some exchanged glances, but everyone knew this would not be a standard press conference. This would be a performance in which Trump was both the main director and the main actor. The conference began at the usual pace. Journalists asked a variety of questions on new economic reforms, about international politics, on the U.S. position on the world stage. Trump answered confidently, handling complex topics with his usual ease. "America continues to grow. We are strengthening the economy, creating new jobs. We are doing what many previous administrations could not achieve." He spoke calmly, but every word was thought out, every sentence emphasized his position. Everything was going according to the standard scenario until one journalist stood out from the rest. Unexpected turn: liberal journalist takes the stage. A hand went up in the second row. Trump looked towards the journalist and nodded. "Yes, please. Your question." A middle-aged man with a smug smile and a sharp gaze took the microphone. John Phelps, a well-known reporter from one of the major liberal media outlets, had made headlines for his provocative questions. He never missed an opportunity to criticize Trump's policies and always tried to hit him in interviews. And now he was ready for a new attack. He raised the microphone to his lips and, bowing his head, said, "Mr. President, today we are talking about appointments to key positions. But here is my question. Don't you think that the appointment of Karoline Leavitt as the White House press secretary is a huge mistake?" Silence reigned in the hall. Trump's expression didn't change. Phelps, sensing that he had attracted attention, decided to move on. "But she is too young," he continued. "Can a person of her age be prepared for such a responsible job? Or perhaps it was not her abilities that played a role here, but something else? Perhaps this was simply a convenient political appointment, and not a real professional choice." He said this with a clear hint, hoping to throw Trump off balance. All eyes were on the president. The journalists froze, waiting for his reaction. Some people were already anticipating a big scandal. But Trump was in no hurry to respond. He paused for a long moment, looking directly at Phelps. There was tension in the air. It seemed that now an answer would follow that would change the course of the conference. Some operators pressed the record button, journalists froze over their laptops, and some even stopped breathing. And finally, Trump smiled. He took a sip of water, placed the glass on the podium, and, slowly leaning towards the microphone, calmly said, "What a wonderful question." Phelps smiled contentedly. He thought he had the president cornered. But he didn't know that Trump had already won the argument. The answer no one expected. The president raised his eyebrows and continued, "John, I noticed that you often asked me questions. This is commendable. I even began to miss you when you were absent from the last conference. Are you sick?" A quiet chuckle was heard in the hall. Some journalists smiled because they understood that the most interesting part was about to begin. Phelps didn't have time to answer because Trump had already developed his thought. As for Karoline Leavitt, I like the way you talk about age. I think that's discrimination, John. Are you judging a person by their age instead of their merits? Is that the new policy of your paper? Phelps was at a loss. But Trump didn't stop. Karoline Leavitt is one of the most professional and competent professionals I have ever met. She is not only smart, but talented. She knows her job better than many of the people who try to criticize her. He paused and added coldly, "You have no right to judge a person for his age. She is an experienced specialist, period." The audience sighed. Phelps opened his mouth to say something, but it was already clear he had lost the argument. Trump didn't let him feel superior, he turned the situation against the journalist himself. And that was just the beginning. The conference was not yet over, but it was already clear that this moment would go down in history. A tense silence fell over the room. After Trump's words, journalist Phelps clearly felt that his attack had failed. He expected an irritated response, an outburst of emotion, perhaps a crude joke or an attempt to avoid direct discussion. But instead he received a calm, confident, and impeccably constructed response that left him no chance for further attack. However, he was not going to stop. At such moments, reporters in his circle understood that if the first blow did not reach the target, they had to strike again, otherwise the moment was lost. He quickly pulled himself together, nodded to the cameraman who held the camera on him, and raised the microphone again. "Mr. President, isn't it obvious that your administration makes personnel appointments based on personal preferences rather than professional merit? I understand that you are talking about experience, but aren't there many more qualified candidates for the press secretary position? Are you really saying that no one else could do a better job?" Trump smiled faintly and nodded slowly, as if anticipating the question. He folded his hands on the podium, looked the reporter straight in the eye, and spoke in the same calm but firm voice. "John, I like your enthusiasm. You are so persistent that sometimes I think you want to join my administration. Have you thought about it?" A few chuckles rippled through the room. Some of the reporters exchanged glances, and some smiled faintly. But Phelps was not one to be easily embarrassed. He did not look away, continuing to wait for an answer. Trump paused for a few more seconds, then continued. "I didn't appoint Karoline Leavitt because I like her. I appointed her because she is a professional. You are talking about more competent candidates? Name me at least one. A person who would do a better job than her. A person who has the same knowledge, the same experience in the media space, the same strategic training, but is older. Just a specific name, please." Phelps clearly had not expected to be asked to name anyone in particular. He had expected an abstract answer, either evasive or overly broad, but not a direct challenge. He paused for a moment, then spoke quickly. "Well, there are many experts, people with many years of experience in the field of state press service." "Name one," Trump interrupted again, still speaking calmly. "At least one name." Phelps paused for a moment, then mumbled something quickly, naming a former press secretary who had served in the previous president's administration. Trump chuckled. "Oh, yeah? A great candidate if you liked press secretaries who read from a piece of paper, avoid tough questions, and hide from the cameras. Is that what you want?" Phelps didn't answer. He couldn't answer because any answer he gave now could be used against him. The room buzzed again, some taking notes, some typing quickly on a laptop, and Trump continued. "Are you saying that young people are not capable of holding responsible positions? Then why, for example, did the founders of the world's largest companies start their careers before they were 30? Why do young people create technologies that millions use? Or is it something else, John?" The journalist tried to say something again, but Trump did not give him the opportunity to take the initiative. Age is not a guarantee of experience, just as age does not automatically make a person incapable of doing their job. It's different. It's about how prepared you are, how professional you are. Karoline Leavitt has proven her competence at every stage of her career. She doesn't just talk beautifully, she knows how to build a strategy, how to work with the press, how to protect the interests of the state. And she does it better than many others. The room fell silent again. John Phelps looked as if he was trying to find a new point of attack, but he knew the situation was not in his favor. Every argument he made was being dashed by the facts, which the president presented with confidence and calm. He tried to turn the conversation into a personal matter, to hint at bias or nepotism, but all he got was evidence that his criticism was unfounded. "Okay, let's say she's coping," he finally said, trying to take another line. "But don't you think her young age creates a risk that she won't be able to handle the pressure? After all, this is one of the most difficult positions in the country. Isn't that a risk?" Trump chuckled again. "John, you said yourself that she's too young. Now you're saying that she's under too much pressure. So make up your mind, either her age is a hindrance, or she's too young to be stressed. I've confused you a little, haven't I?" The room erupted in laughter. Even some liberal journalists couldn't help themselves. Some slapped their hands on the table, some just smiled, but everyone understood Trump had won again. He didn't let Phelps control the conversation, didn't let him paint him into a corner. On the contrary, he turned the situation so that the journalist now looked like a person who couldn't decide on his own position. Phelps pursed his lips, but knew there was no point in continuing. He stepped back, bowed his head, and sat back down. Trump looked calmly around the room and, leaning slightly toward the microphone, said, "Next question." After the tense dialogue between Trump and journalist Phelps, the atmosphere in the room noticeably changed. The president once again proved that he can take a punch, and not just parry attacks, but turn the situation in his favor. But the dispute was not over yet. The journalist, although he had lost the initiative, was not going to give up. He knew that if he continued to attack, he still had a chance to squeeze out a headline from this confrontation that could be presented favorably in the news. Phelps took the microphone and spoke again, chuckling slightly. His tone was more cautious now, but there was still a hint of a sniping at Trump. He said the president had cited examples of young people who had succeeded in business and academia, but that government was different. He emphasized that politics was not a field where one could learn on the fly, and that being a press secretary required not only intellect but also an understanding of diplomacy, interacting with world leaders, and the ability to anticipate the consequences of every word. Trump smiled. He took his time, as if enjoying the journalist trying to justify his defeat. He slowly raised his hand to the microphone and spoke calmly. He recalled that there were many examples in U.S. history when young leaders made decisions that changed the course of history. He cited presidents who took office at a relatively young age and did better than many political veterans. He noted that Karoline Leavitt had already proven herself as a professional and, despite her age, had enough experience for this job. Some of the journalists in the room glanced at each other. They realized that Trump had once again masterfully turned the tables on himself. He was not just defending Leavitt, he was making her a symbol of competence, contrasting her with outdated stereotypes. He was talking not just about her, but about the principle that a person should be judged not by his age, but by his accomplishments. It was a strategic move that would allow him not just to win the argument, but to create a favorable image for his administration. Phelps tried to get another line in, but Trump didn't give him a chance. He looked straight at him and asked, "Do you really think you have to be a professional to be a professional? Or do you just not like the idea of a young woman in a high-ranking position?" The room buzzed again. The question was phrased in such a way that the journalist was trapped. If he persisted, he would be accused of sexism or bias. If he backed down, he would be admitting that his argument didn't hold up. He paused, deep in thought, but the journalists around him already knew the fight was lost. Some of them wrote down what he said, others waited for him to continue, but one thing was clear: Trump had won again. He hadn't just answered, he had put his opponent in a position from which it was difficult to escape. Trump, realizing he had the situation under control, paused for a moment. He looked around the room, took a sip of water, and then continued speaking. He was no longer responding to Phelps but to everyone. He said that everyone, regardless of age or gender, should have the opportunity to hold high office if they are worthy. He emphasized that his administration would always rely on competence, not on the biased standards imposed by the media. At this point, several journalists, even those who did not like Trump, nodded involuntarily. They could not help but admit that he was speaking logically and persuasively. They may not have supported his policies, they may not have liked his style, but they could not argue that his position on this issue was absolutely clear and reasonable. Phelps realized that he could no longer continue this argument without permanently damaging his reputation with his colleagues. He lowered the microphone, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his arms over his chest. It was his silent surrender. He did not want to admit defeat out loud, but it was clear to everyone in the room that he did not intend to ask any more questions. Trump grinned like a man who had just settled an argument. He leaned slightly toward the microphone and said with a slight smile, "Who's next?" After Phelps stopped speaking, the conference seemed to be returning to normal. But tension was still in the air. Reporters exchanged glances, some took quick notes, and cameramen kept their cameras on Trump. He had just demonstrated his trademark ability to emerge victorious from verbal battles, but it was clear that this was not the end. There were still those in the room who wanted revenge. The next reporter, a tall man in a gray suit, raised his hand. His name was Mark Lawrence, and he also represented a liberal publication. But his manner was different. He did not push with impudence, did not try to play on emotions. Instead, he spoke clearly and with restraint, which made his questions even more dangerous. He took the microphone and, looking directly at the president, asked, "Mr. Trump, you say that your administration relies on professionals, regardless of their age. But shouldn't we take into account that such positions require not only knowledge, but also extensive experience in working under stressful conditions? How can you be sure that Ms. Leavitt will be able to withstand the pressure that inevitably arises in such a high position?" The question was more diplomatic than Phelps's outburst, but it was essentially the same thing. It was just couched in a more reasonable, less aggressive way. Trump chuckled slightly, as if he had been expecting it. He looked from the reporter to the audience, as if letting everyone know that he was about to give an answer no one would forget. He leaned towards the microphone and, after a short pause, spoke. "Let's look at this question from another angle. Imagine that we deny a young person a high position because he allegedly cannot withstand the pressure. But don't people with more experience also feel pressure? Is stress something that depends on age?" Some journalists looked at each other. It was a good argument. Trump continued, "I've worked with hundreds of people, of all ages, of all experiences. And you know who can handle pressure best? Not those who have been sitting in their offices for a long time, waiting for their moment. But those who are used to challenges, who are not afraid of responsibility. If you look at Karoline Leavitt, you'll see that she is exactly that kind of person. She didn't just come to this position by chance. She has proven that she can work with the press, that she can withstand attacks, that she can clearly articulate the position of our administration." There was another murmur of approval in the room, some nodding, some quickly writing down what was said. But Lawrence was not going to give in so easily. He nodded and, tilting his head slightly to the side, clarified. "But still, Mr. President, weren't there more experienced candidates?" Trump laughed, not mockingly, but as if he genuinely found the question funny. He spread his hands, as if surprised that he was being asked about it again. "Of course there were," he said. "I could have appointed someone who had spent 20 years in an office avoiding tough questions. I could have taken someone who could talk nicely but couldn't take a punch. But I needed someone who knew how to respond to challenges, not just sit in a cushy seat." Trump paused, looked out at the room, and then added, "I appointed Karoline Leavitt not because she is young, but because she is the best." After these words, the room erupted in applause again. Some journalists continued to frown, realizing that the president had once again emerged victorious from a difficult situation. Lawrence realized that there was no point in pressing the question any further. He nodded, acknowledging that the answer had been received, and sat down in his seat. Trump looked around the room with satisfaction. It was clear to him that he had once again demonstrated that his administration made decisions not under pressure, but based on the real qualities of people. But he knew that there might be another blow ahead. There was always someone trying to make the final lunge. And such a person was found. A thin woman with her hair pulled back into a bun stood up from the back row. Her voice was cold, her eyes determined. She introduced herself as a reporter for an independent online publication and asked her question. Mr. Trump, you defend your personnel decisions so vehemently. But isn't this controversy proof that there was strong public opposition to Ms. Leavitt's appointment? Doesn't it suggest that your decision was, to put it mildly, controversial? The question was framed in a way that implied a mistake. It suggested that the very need to defend Leavitt's appointment meant the decision was moot. It was a subtle move, but Trump saw through it immediately. He tilted his head to the side, as if considering, and then smiled again. You know, I always found it funny to watch people create a problem and then wonder why it has to be solved. After all, it was you, dear journalists, who decided that age was a problem. It was you who raised this issue. The woman tensed, but Trump continued, not giving her a chance to interrupt. If I had appointed someone older, you would have found another reason to argue. Maybe he doesn't speak well enough? Maybe he dresses the wrong way? Maybe you don't like his smile? Laughter was heard in the hall again. The president paused again and then concluded. The truth is simple. If Karoline Leavitt were a man, if she were 10 years older, no one would even ask this question. The woman tried to say something, but then applause broke out. And not only from those who supported Trump, but also from those who simply could not help but recognize the logic of his words. The journalists looked at each other, realizing that the president had managed to turn the situation around again. He had not just answered, he had made everyone think about why the question had arisen in the first place. Trump glanced around the room, giving the reporters a break. He took another sip of water, leaned back, and said with a smile, "Next question." The echo of the final applause had not yet died down in the hall, but the atmosphere had already begun to change. Reporters who had been trying to attack Trump just a few minutes earlier were now carefully going over possible topics for questions in their heads, realizing that any of them could turn out to be unfavorable to them. The conference had not yet come to an end, but the feeling that the main confrontation had already taken place was in the air. Trump knew he had won the argument. He hadn't just responded to the journalists' attacks, he had turned the tables. Instead of defending the appointment of Karoline Leavitt, he had embarrassed the journalists themselves by forcing them to question why the issue had even been raised. He knew his responses were already spreading across social media, and his supporters would be happy to use the moment as evidence that the press was biased. Some journalists tried to take the floor, hoping to change the subject and get away from Karoline Leavitt. They asked about economic policy, international relations, sanctions. Trump answered calmly, confidently, but it was clear that his thoughts were still on the previous topic. He knew that this debate would not remain within the walls of the conference room. He knew that his words would be discussed across the country. Yet there remained one man who was not ready to give up. In the far corner of the room, the microphone rose again. This time, the speaker was a journalist who had been silent before, but had clearly been biding his time. It was Paul Harris, a reporter for a well-known television channel who had been critical of Trump on more than one occasion. Unlike Phelps and Lawrence, he did not make any sharp attacks, but his questions were always designed to back his interlocutor into a corner. "Mr. President," he began with a slight smile, "you talk a lot today about professionalism and competence, but don't you think that the public reaction to this appointment shows a lack of confidence in your choice?" Trump narrowed his eyes slightly, as if studying Harris. "What do you mean by public reaction?" he asked calmly. "Well, many analysts and experts have expressed doubts," Harris replied, "and there is a lot of discussion on social media. Don't you think that this is an indication that your choice has been, to put it mildly, controversial?" Trump chuckled again. The question was predictable, but it implied that if people were talking, something was wrong. He pretended to consider it, then leaned toward the microphone and spoke. "Paul, I'm glad you raised this issue. You say that society is debating this appointment. But let's be clear, is it being debated because it is genuinely controversial, or because people like you are making a show out of it?" The hall again heard approving cries, and someone even laughed quietly. Let me explain how it works, Trump continued. First, a few journalists decide they want to make a story. Then they ask provocative questions, create an artificial scandal, and then they discuss it themselves. And suddenly we see headlines: public criticizes Trump's decision. But it's not the public. It's you. Harris bowed his head slightly, but did not interrupt. And you know what's most interesting? The president continued. The moment you stop discussing this, the topic disappears. Because people care about how the administration works, not about Karoline Leavitt's age. At that point, it became clear that Harris had also lost. He had tried an old trick, creating the illusion of public discontent, but Trump had cleverly exposed his tactics. Now the journalist himself looked like a person who was artificially inflating the topic. Trump looked at him, then at the other reporters, and added with a slight grin, "I think this issue is closed." He leaned back, waiting for the next question. But the room fell silent. No one was rushing to attack again. The questions became formal, touched on other aspects of politics, but did not contain the aggression that had been present at the beginning of the conference. A few minutes later, the host announced the end of the press conference. Journalists began to pack their things, some hurried to pass on their report, some discussed what they had heard with colleagues. But everyone understood that the main event of the day was not just a discussion of appointments, but how Trump had once again managed to win the information war. As he left the room, one of his assistants leaned over to him and said quietly, "Mr. President, that was impressive." Trump chuckled and, without stopping, replied, "Did you think it would be different?"